Greetings, this is Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University. This is my Psych 487 Capstone History and Systems lecture on humanism. And so let's go ahead and get started. Humanism comes along at a time in the history of psychology where it's labeled the third force. And you can see here on the screen where the first force was really behaviorism in vogue from the 1920s through the 1960s. The second is psychoanalysis, which actually starts in 1895 but continues strong up until this day. And so humanism is this really third force, third approach, third different perspective that one can take in studying human behavior. From the humanist perspective, it's not a revision of the behavior of behaviorism or psychoanalysis, but it's a replacement. And humanism gets its start in the early 1960s and still has proponents today. Some therapists would definitely call themselves humanist or taking a humanistic approach, but it's not really a school or a system like behaviorism or functionalism or structuralism was. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is before this lecture is over. So I need to hearken you back to the time of the 60s when most of you listening to this weren't alive. The zeitgeist of the time plays a big impact on the role that humanism is going to take within psychology. So humanists and humanism implied that behaviorism was anti-human. So to reduce the human being down to pieces and parts, to equations and formulas like Watson and Skinner would have preferred to do, would be really antithetical to studying what humans are all about. Another component of humanism is that human beings are more than animals behaving in a determined fashion. And so while comparative psychology can give us some insights into behavior, obviously human beings have a much more complexity with communication and language and thought and processing and things like that. And finally, the spirit of the time suggesting that, there were protests against dehumanizing forces, people becoming data. This whole notion of, well, I'm not an individual, but I'm just a number. That resistance against bureaucracy that you see become very prevalent in the 1960s throughout society, desires to control our own manifest destiny, if you will. And so the timing of this in the 1960s, the revolt against behaviorism, the alternative to psychoanalysis, that third force becomes a very popular force in the context of the history that's happening in the 1960s on the whole. So the goal of humanistic psychology, as you can see here on the screen, is the complete description of what it means to be alive as a human being. And so the nice thing about humanism is that it really tries to take into this totality of the person. Remember that psychoanalysis gets started by looking at abnormal behavior and mental illness. Eventually, into the 1920s, psychoanalysis changes and Freud changes his perspective to write and to create theories of personality for everyone. But humanistic psychology starts off that way. They want to understand, these humanists want to understand the complete notion of what it means to be alive as a human. And so you can see here there's an research interest in love, hate, fear, hope, happiness, humor, affection, responsibility, the meaning of life, these big quality of life issues that you may have heard about. And typically, psychologists have had troubles in the past studying these topics due to lack of operational definitions. If you'll recall, behaviorism kind of opened the door to cognitive psychology in a way and really to humanistic psychology in another way. So the neo-behaviorists come along and say, as long as you can operationally define something, then it's studyable within the realm of psychology. And that really opens the door for the segue between neo-behaviorism and cognitive psychology, which is actually the topic of the next lecture in this series. And so the humanists, become legitimized within psychology. So if you can operationally define love or fear or humor, then it becomes a legitimate studyable topic within the realm of psychology. And so humanism starts off really as an approach to take this very positive outlook. And in fact, if you think about humanism, the positive psychology, trend that has emerged in the last 10 to 15 years is really kind of a natural outgrowth of humanistic psychology. Although I'm not so sure that today's positive psychologists would affiliate themselves as humanists, but there's clearly an overlap with regard to the content matter. The criticisms of humanism is that the topics are vague, and it may be due, there wasn't one leader, there wasn't one unifying force. It wasn't B.F. Skinner for neo-behaviorism or John B. Watson for behaviorism. or Sigmund Freud for psychoanalysis, and the list goes on. And so it's kind of vague. It's kind of perhaps even misunderstood within the realm of the history of psychology. And so a humanistic psychotherapist now, that's a specialized version within psychotherapy and within humanism, their focus would be psychologically healthy persons rather than the psychoanalysts' focus on neurotics and psychotic individuals. And so this would be almost like the demarcation between clinical and counseling psychology, although even those boundaries are becoming fuzzy these days. So, for example, the humanistic psychotherapist might help someone going through the normal ups and downs of life and just having really adjustment problems. So going through the divorce or the loss of a loved one or some sort of traumatic event where the person is basically okay but going through a rough patch in life, as opposed to someone who has a very severe disorder like schizophrenia or antisocial personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder and all the things that students like to study in their abnormal psychology class. And so the focus was really on healthy individuals and helping psychologically healthy individuals overcome the minor bumps in the road of the highs and lows of life. And so humanistic psychotherapists, developed all different sorts of types of growth therapy for insight, for self-reflection, and you can see some examples of those types of growth therapies there on the screen. So really probably one of the most famous people that gets pegged into this category as a humanistic psychotherapist would be Abraham Maslow. And clearly throughout many of your psychology courses, you've heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow begins work as a behaviorist. He becomes interested in the psychologically healthiest people. He studies a small handful of them. He gives them a label calling them self-actualized. So what would that, I'll show you on the next slide what a self-actualized person would be. So Maslow creates this hierarchy of needs. You've seen this dozens of times in an introductory psychology textbook. There's a triangle. At the very top of the triangle, there is self-actualization. Right below that, the esteem for others and self. Below that, love and belonging. Below that, safety, which encompasses security, stability, order, protection, freedom from fear and anxiety. And the final lowest possible part of that triangle, the base of the triangle, if you will, are those physiological needs: food, water, air, sleep, and sex. Things that you need to not only propagate the species, but also to keep human beings alive. And so for Maslow, the notion was, if you're looking at this triangle and you have to satisfy the lower need before you can go to the next higher need. And so it's difficult to satisfy your esteem for others and self if your physiological needs aren't being met. And so really from the triangle's perspective, or from our perspective, you start at the bottom and you work your way up. And so as you have one aspect of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs completed, then you move up to the next higher aspect, assuming that all the ones below that item are being fulfilled at the time. So what would that self-actualized person be? Well, here I've got it on the screen. I'm not going to really read it to you, but you can see some of those characteristics: dedication to work, democratic character structure, creative, high degree of social interest. And so Maslow, this highest pinnacle, this highest point of the hierarchy of needs, has these self-actualized persons, with Maslow identifying that not everyone becomes self-actualized, and many people exist at lower levels without becoming, I guess the phrase would be all you can be. That is, to become self-actualized. Now, some of the criticisms of humanism come through criticizing Maslow's work with regard to a hierarchy of needs. For example, Maslow develops his this idea of self-actualization on the basis of a dozen individuals. He selected them by his own subjective criteria. The terms, if you go back, and I guess I can go back for you, need for autonomy, privacy, and independence, mystical or peak experiences, empathy for humanity. Those all sound pretty good, but as you can see here, they're pretty ambiguous and they're kind of inconsistent. And so you can be creative, but you're very dedicated at work, and and that might go along together, or it might not. And so these notions here about the subjectivity, the ambiguity, and inconsistency are all criticisms of not only Abraham Maslow's work, but also of the humanistic psychology and psychotherapy approach. Another famous humanist within the realm of humanistic psychology and humanistic psychotherapy would be Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers is the originator of what we call today client-centered therapy. Depending on the textbook and the author, it might be noted as person-centered therapy. And so this takes a very different stand from some of the previous psychotherapy approaches from psychology and outside of psychology, such as psychoanalysis. So for the Carl Rogers approach, the responsibility for change rests with the client as opposed to the therapist. And so another one of the terms that Carl Rogers originated was this idea of unconditional positive regard. That is, that an individual needs this unconditional positive regard in infancy, established in infancy to later achieve self-actualization. So there's clearly some connections here within humanistic psychotherapies between Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. So just to kind of give you an idea about this is the stereotypical, in psychology circles, when someone makes a joke about Carl Rogers, it kind of reminds me of Stuart Smalley on Saturday Night Live. This segment where you go, you're good enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. That kind of self-talk would be one of the characteristics of what a humanistic psychotherapist would try to teach a client or a patient. And that is to say, there'd be a lot of reflection and reflective statements. And so rather than the therapist trying to figure it out and solve the problem for the client, the therapist tries to redirect those actions such that the client can come to some self-realization about the next steps and try to learn this problem-solving approach and technique. And so that would be a Rogerian or Carl Rogers based type of approach. What's the status of humanism? Well, humanism still exists today. Humanism is a much broader topic and content area. It's not limited to psychology alone. And so it's not really a school or a system of psychology. The humanists, however, do share some characteristics. They did criticize prior movements. They had their own definition of psychology, and they believe fervently that they are right. And so humanism, it still exists today. It still has influence. But most of the historians and folks who study these types of issues would not label humanism a school of psychology. So why didn't humanism make it into the mainstream? Well, you can see some examples depicted here on the screen. Many humanists are in clinical practice. They're not at universities. It's the university folks who tend to study these types of trends and patterns, whereas the clinicians are in the field. They're doing the actual work. They're seeing clients and patients. So there's not a lot of research into humanistic perspectives. There's, to my knowledge, not a lot of journals available, that specifically dedicated to humanistic outcomes. So there's not a lot of students coming out of graduate school who become researchers who carry on that humanistic tradition. Although positive psychology, to be honest with you, has grown to be quite popular. Some of the central focus of that is on the East Coast in particular. University of Pennsylvania and Penn State it's very big on humanistic psychology and positive psychology, I should say. And then the timing in the 1960s, it kind of gets lost in the crowd. By the 1960s, behaviorism is at the end of its heyday. There are criticisms mounting against behaviorism and neo-behaviorism. Cognitive psychology, that revolution is about to start by the end of the 1960s. Psychoanalysis is being questioned from within the ranks. And so with these two mainstream first and second forces kind of on the ropes, if you will, when humanistic psychology comes along to challenge that, it's kind of like, well, they're already being challenged from within. So there's not really a lot to criticize there when people in their own organizations and own approaches are criticizing from within. The criticisms from the outside just kind of get lost. And so you lose that inertia, you lose that battle to revolt against something when what that something is already being disintegrated from within, so to speak. The contributions of psychotherapy, again, after its initial emphasis in the 1890s with psychoanalysis, in the 1960s we come full circle again, and humanism adds to our focus of consciousness. Also, it kind of broadens this approach to the consideration of the whole person, fosters new methods of therapy. So we've got things based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've got Rogerian, cognitive behavioral is going to emerge here shortly after humanistic. And really, the thing that I think probably one of the big things to remember about humanistic psychotherapy is that it really focused on the whole person. And so it wasn't meant just for abnormal psychology situations. It wasn't designed for the mentally ill. It wasn't a treatment for only that particular subspecialty of people. It was designed much more broadly to, much more applicable to everyone's daily life. And so that humanistic approach believes that people who follow this approach believe that people are basically good and not evil. It's very optimistic, and there's this innate drive towards self-actualization. So why do we do the things that we do? Because we are driven to get to the top of that triangle, driven to get to that top of the hierarchy within Maslow's hierarchy of needs.